I keep seeing these headlines about AM and FM radio stations going dark. And honestly, feels less like the future marching on and more like watching someone slowly strip mine your hometown. Today, I'm going to talk about what's really killing local radio, why it matters way more than Wall Street would like to admit, and what it might take for the stations that are left to actually survive. Now, I got to point out right off the bat before we get any further into this episode that I work in the industry. I'm a former broadcast engineer, now a broadcast network engineer. Been doing this since 2014. So anything that you hear in this episode is going to be strictly my opinion. So I just want to make that clear before we get any further into this episode. So the article that kicked this off from Cord Cutters News talks about this growing number of AM and FM radio stations shutting down across the country, framing it like a natural decline. Listeners shifting to streaming, younger audiences never touching a dial, that sort of thing. It points out that the number of AM licenses in the United States has dropped over the last decade, with hundreds of outlets disappearing on paper even before you count the zombie facilities that are technically licensed but effectively dead. That's the surface level story. Digital is eating radio. But if you actually worked in the industry, like I do, or grown up obsessed with it, like me, that's kind of only half of the story. And honestly, the less interesting half. Because underneath the tech shift, there's this other story happening. Consolidation, financial engineering, and a long line of owners who treated radio like a scratch-off ticket instead of a public service. And that's the part that really pisses me off. Let me back up and put my cards on the table. When I was a kid, I didn't just listen to the radio. I mapped it. Dial scans, call letters, tower sites, who owned what, which jock hopped from which station to which station. This was my baseball stats. Most kids were like, I want to be a firefighter, a policeman, an astronaut. And I was like, I want to either be the guy behind a mic or the nerd in the transmitter building at 2:00, keeping the whole thing alive. And I actually followed through and ended up on the technical side of it. I still work in the industry. So when I see an article saying a growing number of AM and FM radio stations are shutting down, I don't read that as some abstract trend line or clickbait article, headline, whatever. I read it as another community just lost a signal that could have been theirs. Now, yeah, the listening landscape has completely blown up. I get that. We've got streaming, podcast, TikTok, YouTube, satellite radio, the whole buffet of all you can eat, whatever. You get niche music, hyper specific talk, 24/7 background noise tailored to your exact mood at any given time of the day. Nobody's pretending radio is the only game in town anymore. But here's the thing. Radio didn't fade out of popularity just because Spotify exists. Radio got kneecapped over and over by corporate owners who thought you could run a station like a spreadsheet and the audience would just stick around out of habit. You could see the pattern. Buy every radio station in a region, cut costs to the very bare minimum, syndicate everything, fire all the local talent, voice track from 3 states away, make the programming so generic that if a station's legal ID didn't fire, you'd have no idea what city you were listening to. That's not the market evolving. That's setting the building on fire and then blaming the weather. A lot of big owners treated radio like a temporary asset class. They'd scoop up clusters, jack up leverage, flip formats constantly to chase whatever the research consultants said they should, and then act shocked when the debt load didn't match the ad market. Then you start seeing bankruptcy headlines, restructuring, lenders taking over. Meanwhile, the actual product, the sound coming out of the speakers in your kitchen, your car, and stores, they got worse. No local DJs, no local personality, no one answering the phones, automation that doesn't know how to handle a storm warning, no community events that aren't just thinly disguised ad buys. And the owner's going, weird, ratings are down. Must be the internet. No, man. It might be that you turned something local and weird into, local, weird, and human into an audio spreadsheet. And because they're doing this at such a large scale, when they finally lose interest, it's not one station that disappears, it's entire clusters of stations. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, a growing number of signals just quietly vanish or go into this weird half-life where they're technically on the air, but they're spiritually dead, basically. To me, it feels a lot like how some of these giant media conglomerates are treating everything else. They buy something that actually means something to people, a TV network, a streaming service, a game studio, and then, and their entire playbook is milk the brand, strip out the people who make it good, hit some financial targets, then walk away when the whole thing is hollowed out. They're doing it to local radio. They're doing it to single-family housing. They're doing it to online platforms. They will absolutely do it to TikTok or whatever the next big thing is. If it can be turned into a spreadsheet, someone will eventually try to bleed it dry. Now, contrast that with actual community or locally focused radio. When it's done right, local radio is the weird little superpower. It's one of the few media forms where community can literally have its own voice and its own language about its own issues without having to fight an algorithm or beat out a million other creators online. Community and local stations can and do give airtime to local news no one else is wanting to bother with, put high school sports on the air, cover city council drama that will never trend on social media, cut in with local emergency info faster than a push alert can get to your phone, and play bands from down the street, not just down the label roster. Done right, a local radio station becomes part of the texture of a place. You know the voices. You hear familiar names in the ads. You know that if something truly weird or bad happens, that station will have your back and will be talking about it today, not 3 days from now in an algorithm sanitized recap. That's the stuff we lose when another FM or AM license goes dark. Or when it's technically on, but just simulcasting a cookie cutter national feed with no local windows. And yes, I can say this here, local fucking radio is where it counts. On a podcast, that's just a sentence. On the air, that's an FCC fine, a memo, and probably, let's talk in my office meeting. But I mean it. Local radio is the only part of this medium that still has real leverage. If all you're doing is playing the same 200 songs in the same order as every other corporate cloned radio station, you will absolutely get replaced by people's playlist and whatever streams they're listening to. And you should. You're redundant at this point. But if you're live, local, and actually present in people's lives, if the morning show is talking about the road construction you just drove through, if the midday jock is at the country fair, the county fair, if you hear your neighbor's business in an ad break, that sticks with you. That's something Spotify can't fake with a banner ad. The really tragic part is that we know this model works. There are stations out there that still invest in local talent. Let people actually talk. Partner with local advertisers and, inventive ways instead of just reading rate cards. And they use streaming and podcast as extensions of the brand instead of a replacement for it. And those stations, surprise, surprise, tend to have real loyalty. Shocker, I know. They aren't always the highest rated in the market, but they're the ones who people care about. They're also the ones most likely to survive because they're not just selling GRPs. They're selling actual relationships. So when I see a station go off the air, or I see numbers about hundreds of AM stations disappearing, I don't shrug and say, well, time to move on, I guess. I think, how many of those could have made it if someone actually treated them as local infrastructure instead of distressed asset? There's a line in some of the community radio research that stuck with me. These stations help bridge the digital divide and empower people who otherwise get left out of mainstream media. That's not just a feel-good, grant writing phrase. That's a design spec for what radio could still be. Because even as everything moves online, there are still people with bad or expensive internet. Remote areas where the cell networks don't quite reach or barely work. Older listeners who want something they can just turn on and trust. Communities where local issues never get oxygen on Facebook. Shutting down those stations doesn't just take away music or sports. It takes away a communication channel. And once that tower is gone, once that license is surrendered, it's really hard to get that back. So where does that leave us? If you work in this space, in this industry, engineering, programming, sales, you already know the tension. You're building or maintaining this beautiful, slightly janky RF machine, and over your shoulder, there's a spreadsheet somewhere deciding whether your signal exists 6 months from now. The future isn't radio or streaming. It's local anything versus everything else. Radio just happens to be one of the clearest examples because you can literally hear the difference when it's done right versus when someone's trying to wring the last penny out before they flip the license. Here's my working theory. The stations that make it are going to be the ones that double down on being weirdly, stubbornly local and learn how to use the modern tools. Streaming, podcast, social, not as a replacement, but as a, extra paths into the same local heartbeat. And the rest? They'll quietly disappear into bankruptcy filings and FCC databases. And some article will tally them up like weather statistics. So yeah, I'm concerned, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm still that kid who has that is way too into tower sites and call letters, and now I'm an adult walking into half-abandoned studios thinking, this didn't have to go that way. If I ever do a more in-depth episode, I want to dig into the numbers maybe more. Who's buying, who's selling, what models actually seem to work. But for now, I'll leave you with this. If you have a local station that still feels local, that still sounds like your town, pay attention to it. You don't have to turn it into some morale duty. Just notice that it's there, because as we're learning, once it's gone, it's not coming back easily. And the people making the decisions about that don't always live anywhere near the community that loses out. My name's Tyler. Visit at TylerWoodward.me on Instagram and Threads. Head over to TylerWoodward.com to listen to past episodes, get show notes. You can find links to all the various other things. You can support the podcast if you feel so inclined to do so. And then you can find the links to all the podcast platforms: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and whatever else is listed on there. Leave me a rating and review. I hear that helps. Not sure yet. I'll catch you next time.